Brothers and sisters, elders and youth, those who carry the dust of our ancestors on their sandals, and those who carry the light of tomorrow in their eyes, today we gather not merely to witness a verdict or to comment on a case. We gather to witness a moment where the balance of fear and courage tips, where the weight of an unjust fortune is lifted by the spine of a single human being who refuses to bend. They thought they could crush a movement with a number. They thought 500 million was a wall too high to climb, but a wall made of intimidation is only as strong as the silence it imposes. And today, my friends, there is no silence left in this house. Let me tell you what we saw. In a courtroom polished to a mirror shine, with flags that never sag and lamps that never dim, a man stood accused, not of theft, not of violence, not of deceit, but of audacity. The audacity to look at a fossilized order and say, we will write something new. The audacity to assert that a continent is not a marketplace but a homeland, that a people is not a labor pool but a family, that resources are not a scavenger hunt for outsiders but an inheritance for the children who play under our acacia trees. For this audacity, an arithmetic of punishment was assembled. Lines of zeros were sharpened like spears. A number was chosen as if numbers can tame a thunderstorm. The gavel fell with a sound meant to echo forever. 500 million. 500 million for challenging the order of things. 500 million for telling the truth too loudly. 500 million because those who fear the sunrise always try to lengthen the night. The gavel fell and they expected to see a man crumble. They expected to see shoulders droop and eyes lower, the way colonized scripts taught us to behave when power walks into the room. But he did not lower his eyes, he lifted them. He lifted them, and in that simple act the room shifted, because sometimes the first revolution is simply refusing to look away. He did not shout, he did not curse, he did not plead. He placed his palms flat upon the wooden table, and the whole court could feel that the wood under his hands was the same wood that built school desks in the villages, the same wood that frames the doors of clinics where nurses tend to the night fevers of our children, the same wood that holds up the roofs of the homes where mothers braid courage into the hair of their daughters. In that touch, the courtroom ceased to be a theater and became a place of recognition, a place where a nation's heartbeat could be heard if one was brave enough to listen. He began to speak, not as a defendant begging reduction, but as a witness calling history to the stand. He spoke to the climate of fear and to the arithmetic of fines. He spoke to the long caravans of wealth that have traveled one way for too long, out of our soil, out of our rivers, out of the calloused hands that harvest and mine and sow. He spoke to the paradox of plenty, where lands that feed the world can barely feed their own children. He spoke to the quiet violence of paperwork that signs away a century, and the louder violence of mercenaries who pretend to keep order while carving their initials into the bark of nations. And then he did something the court did not expect. He turned to the gallery, to the clerks, to the journalist, to the bailiffs, and even to the judge whose name would be printed on the judgment. He asked each to remember the first time they were told what fairness meant. Perhaps it was a teacher explaining why the smallest child could not be pushed to the back of the line. Perhaps it was a parent who split a mango into equal slices and made sure everyone had a share. Perhaps it was a grandparent who told stories by firelight about the days when a community would gather to rebuild a roof blown away by a storm. He asked them, each of them, to remember what fairness felt like before power complicated the math. Silence, like a sea at sunrise, spread over the room. It was not submission, it was memory, and in memory, the arithmetic of punishment began to look ridiculous. How do you find a vision? How do you find a heartbeat? You can number cattle, you can price a car, you can invoice a shipment, but you cannot invoice a people rising. You cannot invoice the moment when a child in a dusty classroom raises her hand and says, "Why not us?" You cannot invoice dignity, and they tried. He spoke of contracts signed in languages that were never taught to the farmers whose land would be leased for generations. He spoke of clauses that promise stability, but deliver dependency. He spoke of pipelines underfoot and cables overhead that carry away the future at the speed of light. He spoke of currencies that turn our sweat into dust and our dust into gold for someone else. He detailed it calmly, not in the heated cadence of accusation, but in the slow, meticulous tone of a surgeon explaining how a tumor spreads when ignored. And because truth is precise, the room felt the incision. Each paragraph he delivered had the weight of a decade. Each example he gave was a mirror that refused to blur. He did not ask for pity, he asked for alignment. He did not ask for a discount, he asked for a reckoning with the logic that makes such a fine possible in the first place. And one by one the faces around him changed, not in an instant, not like a trick of light, but like dawn, when the sky argues itself into brightness, and suddenly no one remembers how it was ever dark. The judge adjusted his glasses, and the pen that had been a sword began to tremble, as all swords do when they realize they are made from the same metal as plowshares. The bailiff cleared his throat, not to silence the crowd, but to steady himself. The court reporter's fingers slowed, then steadied, then began to record not just statements but meanings. The cameras zoomed in, and for once the lens did not chase scandal, it searched for understanding. He reminded them that law is a language we teach ourselves to speak, and that the words we choose shape the world we inhabit. If law is a fence, then who is kept out and who is kept in becomes the question that matters most. But if law is a bridge, then the river below no longer separates families, it feeds their crops. He asked, no, he invited the court to choose the bridge. He invited the court to remember that punishment is not the only way societies correct course. Sometimes correction begins with a confession that the map was wrong. He told stories from the villages of market days when strangers became neighbors, of funerals where enemies stood shoulder to shoulder shoveling dirt onto the same grave, of weddings where rival families danced until dawn and discovered that joy sounds the same in every accent. He told stories from the front lines where young medics carry stretchers across broken roads and refuse to ask which faction the wounded man belongs to before stopping the bleeding. He told stories from classrooms where chalk is a precious resource and yet knowledge spreads like rainfall over a thirsty season. In every story he drew a line back to the courtroom, as if threading a necklace of moments and laying it gently around the case itself. You could feel the gem of meaning press against the chest of every person listening. He did not glorify defiance for its own sake. He distinguished between rebellion that burns houses and rebellion that builds roofs. He spoke of the rebellion of planting trees in the wrong season because the right season never seems to come. He spoke of the rebellion of refusing to take a bribe even when your own children need medicine. He spoke of the rebellion of telling your son and your daughter that the same sky covers them with equal promise because the sky has never issued a permit that says otherwise. When asked if he would pay, he smiled with an ache that belongs to all who have watched their people carry burdens older than themselves. He said he would pay what any free person owes when the truth has been told: loyalty to the children, fidelity to the future, and a debt to the ancestors to leave the world less wounded than we found it. The court asked for a number, and he answered with a vow. Sometimes a vow is heavier than gold, and everyone could feel the scale tilt. But let us be honest and unsentimental for a moment. Numbers matter. Roads are built with money, clinics are stocked with money, salaries are paid with money. The question is not whether money matters, it is whether money is the master or the servant. He argued that in this case, the number had been enthroned as a god and worshipped with the incense of fear. He argued that the number was not a measure of harm, but a performance of control. He argued that the number was meant to broadcast that ambition would be punished, that the thought of a different tomorrow would be taxed at rates no one could bear. And in that claim, he tore the masquerade off the sum. The number stood there, naked and shivering, and lost its spell. One by one, those who had come to gloat, those who had arrived to taste the honey of another person's defeat, found that the honey had turned to ash in their mouths. It is difficult to enjoy a spectacle when the mirror is pointed at you. It is difficult to laugh when the joke tells the story of how your own children will ask you someday why you clapped for a punishment that taught the world to price dreams. In that discomfort, conscience got up from where it had been made to kneel and took its seat at the front row. He spoke then of sovereignty, not as a slogan stamped on impossible promises, but as a daily practice of saying yes to the dignity of your people and no to the convenience of your fears. He spoke of the right to refuse contracts that auction the rivers under our grandchildren's feet. He spoke of the right to bless enterprise that builds the muscle of our communities rather than siphoning their lifeblood. He spoke of the right to teach our own histories in our own accents, not to isolate ourselves, but to anchor ourselves so that partnership, when it happens, is not a chain but a handshake. And he did something braver still. He admitted the failures. He admitted the potholes on the road to change, the impatience that can turn brothers into rivals, the temptation to mimic the very force you opposed once you sit in its chair. He admitted that corruption is a worm that does not care what flag flies above the house it eats from within. He admitted that discipline is not the uniform you wear, but the promise you keep when nobody is watching. In that confession, he earned what power rarely earns: trust, because truth, even when it stings, is the only ointment that heals. The cross-examination tried to corner him with figures: growth rates, debt ratios, bond spreads. He listened, nodded, and then answered with a new arithmetic. How do you measure the cost of a mother walking 3 hours to fetch water? How do you measure the interest charged on hope when it is deferred for a generation? How do you amortize the loss of a language when the last grandparent who speaks it slips quietly into the next world? He did not reject numbers, he refused to let them rule, and in that refusal, numbers took their rightful place as servants, not masters. The spectators began to lean forward, not to witness defiance, but to witness construction. He was building something in that room, a scaffold where anyone could stand and see the horizon from a clearer height. And once people see the horizon, they are changed. You cannot convince a person who has tasted the wind of their own freedom to return permanently to stale air. You can distract them, delay them, punish them with fines, but you cannot rechain a mind that has learned its circumference is wider than the cell. When he finished, there was no applause, there was no need. The room itself felt wider, as if the walls had learned to exhale. The judge presented the written order with all the formality that tradition requires. The fine remained ink on the page, but ink is not destiny. It is the beginning of a conversation between today and tomorrow, and in the days that followed, that ink began to smudge under the fingerprints of a people who refused to let a number define their horizon. He left the courtroom not as a victim of arithmetic, but as a teacher of courage. And the strangest thing happened. Those who had defended the fine with elegant phrases and polite disdain found themselves defending something else instead, the possibility that this judgment might be the last gasp of an old world rather than the first word of the new. Journalists who had rehearsed their skeptical smirks replaced them with considered questions. Clerks who had typed orders without a second thought began to read what they typed. Citizens who had lost the habit of hope picked it up again, like a tool their grandparents used to swing every morning. Around kitchen tables and market stalls, in crowded buses and under mango trees, people spoke about what had happened. Not the figure itself that melted quickly into rumor and exaggeration, but the posture. The posture of standing without arrogance, the posture of listening without surrender, the posture of speaking without hatred. That posture is contagious. It spread the way laughter spreads in a room that was too quiet for too long. And once it spread, the court, yes, even the court felt the breeze. Judges are not machines, they are custodians, and custodian is a title of service, not domination. In the weeks that followed, one could see subtle shifts in the jurisprudence, careful recalibrations that suggested the bench was not immune to the oxygen of conscience. Cases were read with a keener eye to context. Contracts were tested not only for legality, but for equilibrium. The word public re-entered the vocabulary of public interest, and though no one admitted it from the bench, everyone knew where that breeze had begun. In a moment when a person refused to let a number outweigh a people. Let us not romanticize the path ahead. Fines can be enforced, accounts can be frozen, projects can be stalled by the bureaucratic mouths of serpents who smile at ribbon cuttings and hiss at reforms. But there is a difference between obstruction and defeat. We have learned to tell the difference. Obstacles are the exercise that sculpts endurance. Defeat is the decision to stop breathing, and we are still breathing. More than that, we are singing. From the northern dunes to the coastal mangroves, from savannah to city square, a chorus is rising that no courtroom can confiscate. It is the chorus of parents who refuse to mortgage their children's future to pay interest on someone else's fantasy. It is the chorus of teachers who look at overcrowded classrooms and still see a parliament of possibility. It is the chorus of farmers who save seed in jars like treasures, who treat rain as covenant rather than luck. It is the chorus of young engineers and coders who design bridges of fiber and steel that connect villages without erasing their soul. It is the chorus of healers who learn to stitch up violence with clinics and counseling, and who know that trauma cannot be exiled by decree, only healed by companionship and time. And yes, it is the chorus of those who wear uniforms. We salute every soldier and officer who understands that the highest rank in a republic is citizen. We salute those who carry arms not to terrorize their neighbors, but to protect the night so that the morning may come. We salute those who refuse orders to become guards of private empires and instead become guardians of public trust. They too have felt the change. They too have realized that the nation is not the property of those who shout the loudest, but the home of those who love the deepest. What then shall we do with our anger? We will refine it into discipline. What shall we do with our grief? We will plant it like a seed and water it with memory until it grows into a tree under whose shade our grandchildren will study. What shall we do with the fine itself? We will transform it into a curriculum. Every school, every court, every council will study the logic that produced such a number, and then we will teach a better logic. We will teach that legitimacy does not descend from charters alone, but ascends from consent. We will teach that prosperity is not a lake to hoard, but a river to share. We will teach that justice is not a performance but a practice, measured not by the elegance of the rulings, but by the tenderness of the outcomes for the most vulnerable among us. To the judge whose name anchors the document, we say this with respect: you were not our enemy, you were our mirror, held up to show us how far we still had to travel. You were a test, and we studied. You illuminated the cost of our courage, and we paid it, if not in currency, then in clarity. And if someday you walk the streets without the robe, and you hear the vendors say that the nation has grown a backbone, know that you were the blackboard upon which the lesson was written. To those abroad who watch the proceedings like a theater of exotic drama, let this be your takeaway: we are not your scenery, we are not a cautionary tale to keep you comfortable. We are a chapter in the universal story that every people must write for themselves, the chapter where the main character refuses a role assigned by an empire's imagination. If partnership is what you seek, you will find in us partners made honest by hardship and faithful by history. If plunder is your secret hope, your ships will find shallow waters. To our children, small and serious, with school bags that weigh more than their bodies and questions that weigh more than their bags, hear this promise: you were not born to inherit a ledger of someone else's audacity tax. You were born to inherit a garden. We will tend it. We will repair its fences not to keep neighbors out, but to keep the goats of greed from eating the seedlings. We will draw water from its well with clean ropes. We will teach you to plant and to code, to barter and to budget, to pray and to debate, to dance and to draft constitutions. We will give you a nation where the border between dignity and opportunity disappears. And to the one who stood in that court and refused to be measured by a sum, we do not carve statues, we cultivate standards. The standard is simple: stand straight, speak true, serve first. Today you did all three. Tomorrow, so must we. You turned a court into a classroom, and you turned a fine into a forge. In that forge we will temper our institutions so that they can hold the heat of our hopes without cracking. Some will say this is poetry. Let it be poetry that builds hospitals. Let it be poetry that paves roads, fills libraries, funds laboratories, irrigates fields, and repairs roofs. Let it be poetry that convinces a tax official to choose integrity over a bribe, a contractor to choose quality over kickbacks, a legislator to choose the long horizon over the short applause. Let it be poetry that pulls us toward the difficult agreements that make a republic real, agreements about land and law, about language and memory, about markets and mercy. Do not misread the day. We did not win because a gavel wavered. We won because a fear faded. We did not win because a number fell. We won because a people rose. The court was not destroyed, it was reclaimed. Judges will still judge, contracts will still be signed, and taxes will still be collected. But from this day forward, none of these will be immune to the question that rang out in that room and echoes now across the land: does this build our children's future, or merely polish someone's throne? If the answer is the former, we will give our sweat and our shillings. If the answer is the latter, we will withhold our consent, and without our consent, power is a costume, not a crown. The sun is setting as I speak, and somewhere a grandmother is lighting a lamp. She remembers another courtroom, another trial, another era when the verdict felt like a fate. Today feels different. It feels like a hinge. On this hinge, the door of our future swings. The hinge is oiled with courage, tightened with truth, and guarded by memory. No fine can rust it. No threat can loosen it. No cynicism can pry it off. So let us go from here with a practical agenda and an unshakable spirit. Pay what is owed to the poor in attention, to the hungry in bread, to the sick in medicine, to the teachers in chalk and salary, to the farmers in fair price, to the builders in honest contracts, to the artists in audience, to the soldiers in clarity of mission, to the elders in honor, and to the children in everything. Let us file the paperwork of a new era, not in the clerk's office, but in the behavior of our days. Let us turn our streets into the jurisprudence of joy. 500 million was supposed to be the story's last punctuation mark, but the story refuses to end. It insists on a comma, on a semicolon, on a breath before the next sentence begins. We will write that sentence together. We will write it in markets and ministries, in classrooms and courtrooms, in kitchens and fields, in startup labs and village squares. And when future historians look back and ask when the center of gravity shifted, they will point to a day when a courtroom witnessed an uncommon spectacle, not a defendant's humiliation, but a nation's maturation. From this day forward, may our laws be bridges, our numbers be servants, our judgments be restorations, and our courage be contagious. May those who sit in high chairs remember that authority is a seat at the people's table, not a throne above it. May those who stand accused of loving their nation too much remember that the only sentence love accepts is service, and may we, all of us, carry away from that room not the smoke of anger, but the fire of purpose. If there must be a final word, let it be this: no sum can bankrupt a people who have invested in each other. No decree can silence a chorus that has learned its own harmony. No court can enclose a horizon that belongs to a sky-wide dream, and no fear can survive in a generation that has decided together to stand up straight and walk forward. Eyes lifted, hands steady, hearts open, into the tomorrow we claim today. Brothers and sisters, when power believes it can purchase obedience with the weight of numbers, defiance becomes a sacred duty. Defiance in the face of injustice is not noise or anger for its own sake. It is disciplined courage, the steady breath that keeps a people from drowning in someone else's decree. It begins with a simple refusal, a refusal to let a price tag be nailed to dignity, a refusal to let fear choose our words, a refusal to bow to a verdict that mistakes authority for truth. In that refusal, spines straighten, eyes lift, the room changes temperature. Those who came to witness a submission instead witness a lesson. Defiance is not chaos, it is clarity. It says if the law forgets the people will remind the law what it is for. It says if a number tries to silence a nation, the nation will teach the number its place. It is the calm voice that answers thunder, the quiet step that crosses a line drawn to keep us small. It remembers that every right we now take for granted was once labeled impossible, irresponsible, illegal, until someone stood still and the storm moved around them. Defiance does not insult, it illuminates. It does not burn down institutions, it opens their windows. It asks judges to be guardians, not gatekeepers, officers to be protectors, not predators, and citizens to be participants, not spectators. It turns the courtroom from a stage of intimidation into a classroom of accountability, where fines become footnotes and principles become headlines. Defiance says to our children, you will not inherit a ledger of fear, you will inherit a vocabulary of courage. Let us be precise, this is not the swagger of bravado, not the clench of hatred. It is the discipline to say no to exploitation and yes to responsibility, no to plunder and yes to building, no to humiliation and yes to the steady work of freedom. It plants trees while the wind mocks the seedlings. It pays debts to the future that no accountant can calculate. And when the gavel falls, defiance listens, rises and answers with a promise. We will measure our society by the tenderness it shows the most vulnerable, not by the terror it can inflict. That promise, kept day after day, is how injustice is unlearned, and how a people, standing together, become ungovernable by fear. My friends, there comes a time when the masks must come off, when the polite disguises of exploitation are stripped away so that the truth stands bare before us. Exploitation does not always arrive with soldiers or chains. Sometimes it arrives with contracts and smiles, with documents written in languages the landowners cannot read, with clauses designed to last longer than the lives of the people signing them. It hides in boardrooms far from the soil it drains, in the quiet hum of machinery that carries our wealth away, while our children fetch water from miles away. Exposing exploitation means speaking plainly about this theft dressed as partnership. It means showing the world how resources flow in one direction, from our earth, from our labor, from our ingenuity, out to distant capitals where our names are forgotten, but our gold, our oil, our cocoa, our uranium, our fish, our very sweat are converted into fortunes. It means revealing that exploitation is not an accident. It is a system designed to look normal, to make dependence seem natural, and to make inequality seem inevitable. We must tell the truth about how markets are manipulated so that our exports fetch the lowest prices while imports drain our reserves. We must speak of how aid sometimes arrives not as a gift but as a leash, tying our policies to the whims of those who write the checks. We must expose how infrastructure is built not to connect our people to each other, but to connect our resources to the ports that ship them away. We must expose the paradox where nations rich in minerals, rich in rivers, rich in talent, are labeled poor simply because the profit from those riches is counted elsewhere. And let me say this, exposing exploitation is not about resentment, it is about realignment. It is about reclaiming the dignity of fair exchange, where partnership replaces plunder and trade builds rather than bleeds. It is about teaching our children that their inheritance is not for sale, that the rivers, forests, and fields belong to the generations yet unborn, and that no signature under pressure can erase that truth. Once exploitation is exposed, it loses its camouflage. Once people see the pipeline of wealth leaving their land, they begin to ask the right question, not can we survive this, but why should we accept this? And the moment that question is asked loudly enough, the system that thrived in shadows begins to tremble in the light. Inspiring collective courage expend in 400 words in speech. My fellow citizens, courage is contagious when it no longer belongs to a single person, but to a people who choose to stand together. Inspiring collective courage is not dramatics or spectacle. It is the gentle accumulation of small, brave acts that together form an unbreakable chain. It begins when one voice refuses silence and another follows, and then another, until what was once lonely becomes legion. It seeds itself in kitchen conversations, in whispered schoolyard exchanges, in congregations, and at workplace tables where people decide they will no longer accept the slow theft of their future. Collective courage grows from shared understanding. When neighbors recognize common hardships and shared hopes, fear loses its monopoly. People who once felt isolated discover they are many, and that realization transforms timidity into mutual resolve. Courage taught one-on-one becomes courage in chorus. Teachers who insist their classrooms will hold dignity, shopkeepers who refuse to overcharge, nurses who demand proper supplies, and farmers who form cooperatives to protect their harvests. Leadership in this context is humble. It does not demand applause, it invites participation. The person who spoke from the courtroom did not seek to be a lone hero, but to ignite the ember already present in others. True leaders craft architectures of courage, spaces, institutions, practices where ordinary people can act without fearing ruin. They draft transparent contracts, support accountable councils, and defend the rights of the weakest. In doing so, they widen the circle of those willing to act, and each new participant becomes a teacher to others. Collective courage also requires discipline. It is not unthinking defiance, but purposeful persistence. It means organizing, educating, and preparing the next generation to carry forward the work. It means turning outrage into policy, grief into infrastructure, and protest into sustainable reform. Such courage tolerates setbacks, learns from mistakes, and uses every small victory to build momentum toward systemic change. It understands that the long game is won by steady, everyday choices more than by single dramatic moments. Finally, inspiring collective courage restores faith in community, in institutions remade by the people, and in a future that can be better than the present. When a nation learns to move together, it gains a force no decree can dismantle, and a voice no fine can silence. That is the power we must cultivate, a shared courage that refuses to let fear write our story, and insists the next chapter be written by us together. Let us teach our children to stand, to debate, to build institutions that honor justice, and to protect the dignity of every neighbor always. My friends, when the instruments of punishment arrive, a fine, a sentence, an order, they are meant to close a story. But punishment can be turned into purpose when we refuse to let it be the final chapter and instead use it as a forge for collective resolve. Turning punishment into purpose begins by refusing victimhood and choosing stewardship. We receive the blow, catalog its lessons, and convert its force into the energy that drives repair and reform. To do this, we must be both practical and imaginative. Practical because penalties have material consequences that require clear plans, support networks for those harmed, funds redirected to sustain civic work, legal strategies to protect communities from predatory enforcement. Imaginative because punishment can also be reframed as a pedagogical moment, an opportunity to teach citizens how systems break and how they should be rebuilt. We transform a punitive sentence into a curriculum that trains a generation to spot the fault lines, to draft better agreements, and to build institutions that serve rather than subdue. Turning punishment into purpose also demands accountability from those who impose penalties. It is not enough to absorb a sanction silently. We must interrogate the rationale behind it and insist on transparency. We must ask, what did this fine aim to correct, and does it address root causes or merely signal power? That interrogation often exposes systemic failures rather than individual guilt. Once exposed, those failures become targets for repair, fairer contracts, stronger cooperatives, regulations that protect commons instead of privileging extraction. Equally important is narrative work. When a people are shamed into silence, the story told about them is skewed. We reclaim the narrative by documenting impacts, sharing testimonies, and framing the event as part of a broader struggle for justice. This reframing transforms public sympathy into political pressure and pressure into policy. Punishment becomes the catalyst for conversations that lead to new laws, institutions, and practices rooted in equity. Finally, turning punishment into purpose requires moral clarity and humility. We accept responsibility where we erred, learn without self-abasement, and pursue remedies that prioritize the vulnerable. We build partnerships across sectors, educators, lawyers, entrepreneurs, farmers, and artists, because durable change is interdisciplinary. In doing so, a fine ceases to be merely a weapon and becomes paradoxically a whetstone. It sharpens resolve, polishes institutions, and readies a people to move from reaction to design and step confidently toward a future we deliberately secure together today. SEO Description. A shocking courtroom twist. A $500 fine meant to crush a leader turns into a powerful moment of defiance as the entire court rallies behind him. Witness the speech, the truth, and the moment the judge loses the room. This is more than a verdict. It's a stand for justice, sovereignty, and the power of courage.